We have two brand new senators from Georgia, bless their hearts, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. Well, Raphael Warnock gave his first speech on the Senate floor on Wednesday, and the subject was voter rights. And restricting voter rights is what the Christian fascists in this country see as their new center of gravity, as the New York Times puts it. They still cluster around Trump, worshiping him, the Antichrist, these Christian fascists. But they understand what we've talked about all this week on this podcast, and that is, if everything else were equal, the Republicans would not have a chance at holding public office, especially not now, because now their scam has been completely revealed. It was revealed in the 4 years of this filthy pig, Donald Trump. And then if there were any doubts left in the minds of people who weren't quite sure, it was all settled after Trump lost the election, and the ensuing charges and lies, the riot, the attack on the United States Capitol, the statements by members of the House and the Senate that the election was fraudulent, it should be overturned. So there is no doubt what the Republican Christian Fascist Party is about. They cannot win elections fairly, so they must suppress the voting power of those people who they know or assume are not going to vote Republican ever anyway. So voting rights. Warnock pointed to a wave of bills that limit voting in Republican-controlled states like Arizona and right here in Georgia. And Warnock said, quote, "We are witnessing right now a massive and unabashed assault on voting rights unlike anything that we've seen since the Jim Crow era. This is Jim Crow in new clothes," end quote. And it is. And it is just outrageous and dumbfounding to see this happening. But I think at this point in our history, given the last 4 or 5 years, we're shocked by anything. Anyway, this is what Senator Warnock said. I'm quoting, "Politicians in my home state and all across America, in their craven lust for power, have launched a full-fledged assault on voting rights. They are focused on winning at any cost, even the cost of democracy itself. I submit that it is the job of each citizen to stand up for the voting rights of every citizen. And it is the job of this body to do all that it can to defend the viability of our democracy," end quote. It's the duty of this body, the Senate, where the bill H.R. 1 that dealt with, is that the bill that dealt with voting rights? Not a single, not one, not a single Christian or any member of the Christian Fascist Party, aka the Republicans, voted to defend the viability of democracy by putting into play the rights of people, citizens of the United States, where it concerned voting. Now, to that end, what Warnock's talking about, defend the viability of our democracy, Senator Warnock argued that the Senate should pass the For the People Act. I guess that's what the name of it is, not H.R. 1. I get confused. And the For the People Act, which would establish automatic voter registration nationally, It would provide for at least 2 weeks of early voting. It would preserve mail-in balloting, as well as preserving the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore pre-clearance to the Voting Rights Act. Now, if you remember what the Voting Rights Act was, it was passed because so many states, mostly in the old Confederacy, although there were states in districts in Arizona, I believe the state of Arizona, where the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that prohibited this shit, was it 65? Where it prohibited changes in the laws of the states where it concerned voting without approval of the Justice Department. This was back when the Justice Department, which was set up, by the way, to protect the rights of African Americans after the abolition of slavery to have the right to vote. That's what the Justice Department was set up for, that and to stop violence against black folk. But some of these states started whittling away at the Voting Rights Act until finally it went to the Supreme Court, 3 years ago, and the Supreme Court, to its everlasting shame, removed that section of the Voting Rights Act that said these states that were under the watchful eye of the Justice Department because of their trickery to stop black people from voting, that these states no longer had to submit to the Justice Department. This is what the Supreme Court ruled. No longer had to submit to the Justice Department what they wanted to do where it concerned changing the voting laws of their state, which opened the door for what the white fascist, Christian fascist party is now doing. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore that pre-clearance to the Voting Rights Act. In other words, if you want to change things in your state, because you have a history of denying people the right to vote, you have to get the approval of the Justice Department. That was the part that was taken out. Now, these bills are important, but there's no reason to talk about them in the context of Reverend Warnock's speech. He's the first African American to represent Georgia in the Senate, the first, not since such and such a date, but the first, and only the second African American elected to the Senate from the South since Reconstruction. The other one is in South Carolina. So his presence on the Senate floor is historic, just because he's there. And as Jamel Bowie wrote for the New York Times, his presence represents progress, but it also is evocative of the past. A black lawmaker from the South urging his mostly white colleagues to defend the voting rights of millions of Americans is, as Jamel Bowie writes, an occasion to revisit one particular episode in the history of American democracy. And that was the fight in Congress over the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Now, stay with me on this, because this is another thing that we whites need to know, and we don't. Maybe you do. But I had never heard of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Have you? The first black members of the U.S. House of Representatives, and some of them were former slaves, were very prominent in this battle during the debate on the Civil Rights Act of 1875. They saw the bill as a fight against discrimination and race hierarchy. And the arguments they made, as Jamel Bowie points out, still resonate in our own time and found echoes in what Raphael Warnock was saying on Tuesday. What Bowie is talking about, the writer, is the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that most of us whites, I would venture, have never heard of. What that act did was ban racial discrimination in public accommodations in a way that was similar to what would eventually become law more than 90 years later with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, the white guy, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, struggled to bring the bill to the Senate floor. And it was blocked in committee in 1871 and then blocked again as an amendment to a different bill the following year. And that year it was killed by a Democratic filibuster. You notice how the filibuster has been used so many times to stop an attempt to guarantee equal protection, equal rights under the law for our black brothers and sisters. So Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, tried again in 1873 by introducing a modified version of his bill in conjunction with a similar proposal in the House. And his revised bill added a clause that said, quote, "No citizen of the United States shall, by reason of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, be accepted or excluded from full and equal enjoyment of common schools, public institutions of learning, the same being supported by money derived from general taxation or authorized by law." I'm sorry, the pollen down here is starting to get to me again. It's that time of year. Now, it was that schools clause, according to Mr. Bowie, that proved especially controversial. The radical Republicans viewed school desegregation as a necessary component of achieving a truly colorblind nation. Now, let's remember what the Republicans were back in the day. The Republicans were not what they are today. They were not Christian fascists. They were more like Christian Democrats, small d. They were interested in protecting the rights of everybody in the United States who was a citizen. Not anymore. Now, the opponents of what the radical Republicans were trying to do saw, and these were the Democrats, they saw school desegregation as ending, collapsing, a distinction between public rights and social rights that would allow the government to, quote, invade all provinces of an individual's life, end quote. Now, this was back in the 1870s, but you notice the similarity of language, of course. So when the Republicans, the good guys back then, tried to pass the Civil Rights Bill in 1875, in a lame duck session of Congress, it was the schools clause that proved impossible to bring across the finish line. Think about that for a minute. I mean, that's the part of the sordid story that always just freaks me out. The white people did not want black people to be educated. And I think it's very clear why. An educated mind is a free mind. And a free mind says, fuck you, when the rights granted to that free person are being infringed by a bunch of racist jerks. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.